They wanted proof for everything, even for my pain. That's how I opened my mouth that night with words I never imagined I'd have to say. They wanted evidence. Evidence for my loyalty, evidence for my patience, evidence for the bruises that don't fade quickly enough. And in the end, Daniel gave them exactly what they were asking for. His hand, my body, the floor. My husband, the man whose signature once joined mine on papers that promised forever, set his palm on my shoulder as if steadying me and then pressed down just enough to turn comfort into betrayal. It wasn't loud. Not the kind of shove that would have broken furniture or made excuses easier. It was quieter, deliberate, measured, the kind of move that accountants like me know too well, an entry you can't erase, a number you can't pretend away. The fall wasn't long, but it stretched. My knee caught the edge of tile. My palms met cold stone, and in that suspended second between standing and breaking, I realized what silence really sounds like. It is not absence. It is presence. The silence of a room full of witnesses who choose not to move, not to gasp, not to stop what's unfolding. Lydia, Daniel's sister, had her lips parted, but not in alarm. There was satisfaction there, the tiniest lift at the corner of her mouth, as if my stumble was the punchline she had been waiting years to hear. Helen, my mother-in-law, didn't flinch. She sat perfectly composed, fingers pressed into her lap, every gesture rehearsed like a woman in a portrait who knows the family name must never be disturbed. Her eyes did not meet mine. They didn't have to. Her silence was already an answer. And Daniel. He just straightened his tie, smoothed the sleeve of his shirt, and looked at me with the same calm expression he used when correcting an error in a spreadsheet. No rage, no guilt, just numbers balancing themselves out. A column of betrayal perfectly aligned. I lay there, not broken, but marked the way glass hums after it's struck intact, but vibrating with the knowledge it could shatter. And in the air above me, floating like a thread too fine to catch, was a smile. Not a laugh, not a word, just the unmistakable curve of delight. Someone had been waiting for this, and in that smile, the silence found its signature. The body remembers things differently than the mind. My knee still stung, but my chest remembered the weight of Daniel's hand more vividly than the bruise would ever show. My breath remembered being stolen mid-sentence. My skin remembered the cold shock of the floor as a kind of evidence no one could file away. And my ears remembered the chandelier's hum, each crystal vibrating like it wanted to speak, like it wanted to scream for me when no one else did. I am an accountant. I save receipts. I archive evidence, I collect the paper trails people think don't matter. I used to believe that was protection, that if I just had enough proof, truth would win. But proof means nothing when a whole room refuses to see it. That night, I learned sometimes the receipts don't live in files. They live in silence, in the absence of protest, in the complicity of a family that looks away. I stayed on the ground longer than I needed to, not because I couldn't rise, but because I wanted to watch them. To see who would move, who would pretend, who would reach for me. No one did. They watched me like I was a stain spreading across the tablecloth. And that smile, sharp as ink, lingered as the only commentary. They wanted proof of my pain, and Daniel provided it, gift-wrapped in silence. His hand, my fall, their silence. And the smile that carved its own place in memory, the line item on a ledger I never agreed to balance. That's how betrayal announces itself, not with a shout, not with blood, but with silence. And the silence that night was louder than any scream. 3 months before that night, before the silence and the smile, there were the smaller things, the ones that creep into your life disguised as concern. Daniel told me he needed me to start keeping a symptom journal. He said it was for my own good, to help me keep track of the headaches I sometimes got after long days at work, or the fatigue that came when I stayed late balancing someone else's books. He even bought me a leather-bound notebook with crisp lines, pressed it into my hands like a gift. Like proof that he cared. Write down how you feel, he told me, every detail every day. At first it seemed thoughtful. He kissed the top of my head and said, "This is how we'll figure out what's wrong." But slowly the notebook turned into something else, something I didn't own anymore. Each entry felt like a report card. Each word felt monitored, graded. When I wrote that I was tired, he would circle it with his finger as if the word itself was evidence against me. When I didn't write enough, he asked why I wasn't cooperating. The notebook that was supposed to help me heal became a ledger of suspicion. Then came the day I reached into my bag for a pen and pulled out something that wasn't mine. A recorder. Small, sleek, tucked between receipts and my wallet, almost hidden, but not enough. My fingers froze around it. It wasn't the kind of thing you stumble across by mistake. It was deliberate, placed there by someone who needed more than my words on paper. Someone who needed my voice. My life captured without consent. My chest tightened as I clicked it off, my own breath caught in the silence. I rewound it just enough to hear my own voice, muffled, tired, muttering to myself in the car the day before. Every sound was there, private thoughts I hadn't meant for anyone. It felt like finding my own diary printed in someone else's handwriting. I turned it over in my hand, the way you study an object you want to deny but can't. And I knew it wasn't random. Daniel had slipped it there. Who else could it have been? Who else had that calm patience, the accountant's precision? The need to turn every part of me into evidence. My own husband had been auditing me the way he audited spreadsheets, cross-checking for errors, looking for inconsistencies, reducing my existence to proof of something only he seemed to believe in. I thought of the notebook again, the endless lists he had asked me to make, and realized it was all part of the same thing. The journal, the recorder, the endless questions. What did you eat? How did you sleep? Did you feel dizzy? How tired were you? He wasn't helping me. He was cataloging me. The worst part wasn't the betrayal, though. That was sharp enough. It was the performance he kept up in daylight, the way he held doors open for me at family dinners, the way he rested his hand on the small of my back like a good husband should. To anyone else, Daniel looked devoted. But I knew that when his hand touched me, he was thinking about the entries in that notebook, about the recordings in that device, about how every part of me could be measured, stored, used. That night, I slid the recorder back into my bag and sat perfectly still at the kitchen table until he came home. He asked about dinner, kissed my cheek, and went to wash his hands. I said nothing. I didn't confront him, not then. I wanted to see how far he'd go. I wanted to know if he would tell me himself, if he would ever admit what he was doing. He never did. He just kept smiling, that calm accountant's smile, like everything was already balanced. I learned to pretend after that, to act like I didn't notice when my words echoed back to me in his questions, when my private thoughts showed up in his accusations. I wrote in the journal with neat lines, I kept the recorder where I found it, and I let him believe I was blind. But every day the weight of it pressed heavier. Being watched changes you. It makes you second-guess the way you breathe, the way you cough, the way you sigh. It makes you question what is yours and what has already been stolen. They wanted proof for everything, even my pain, and Daniel had been gathering it long before his hand pushed me that night. The journal, the recorder, the silence he wrapped around us like cellophane. Have you ever discovered someone was secretly watching you? Comment 1 if yes, 0 if no. At the office where numbers should have been the only things falling, it was a single sheet of paper that slipped from the folder in my arms and scattered across the floor like a loose feather. I didn't even notice it at first. Not until Nina bent down and picked it up, holding it between two fingers like something fragile. Her eyes flicked across the page, not long enough to read everything, but just enough for me to see the recognition in her face. "You should keep this somewhere safe," she said quietly, her voice low, almost cautious, as if she already understood what it was without needing the whole story. And then she handed it back to me. A single page. Test results. My name printed at the top, my body turned into numbers charts, conclusions that felt more like sentences than answers. The paper looked so ordinary, so harmless, just black ink on white stock. But in my hands, it shook like it was alive, like it wanted to betray me as much as the people I shared a roof with. I pressed it tight against my chest, my heartbeat thudding so loud I was sure Nina could hear it. I wanted to ask her what she thought she saw, what conclusions she drew in the seconds her eyes moved across the words. But I couldn't. My throat locked. There was no explanation I could give her, no defense that wouldn't sound like weakness. And I knew she wasn't the one I had to fear. Nina had always been steady practical, the kind of colleague who noticed without prying. But still, the fact that she had touched it, that someone else had seen the evidence Daniel had been waiting to use against me, made the room tilt just slightly under my feet. I slipped the paper back into the folder as quickly as I could, but it didn't matter. I had already felt the difference. Before, those results were just words locked away in my head. Words I tried to reason with at night when Daniel asked too many questions. Now they were real physical proof of something I wasn't ready to name. And once proof exists, once it's printed and stamped, it can't be undone. The rest of the day passed in fragments. Spreadsheets, emails, calls, I went through the motions, but the paper burned in my bag like it had its own pulse. Every time I reached for a pen or shifted my chair, I felt it there, reminding me that my body wasn't entirely mine anymore. It was data held on a page that could slip-fall be read by someone who wasn't supposed to know. On the train home, I pulled it out again. My hands trembled as I folded and unfolded it as if the creases themselves could erase the words. But they stayed. Numbers that didn't lie. Phrases that carried too much weight, elevated, abnormal, inconclusive. Words that could be twisted, used, filed away in the wrong hands. And I knew exactly whose hands would want it. When I walked through the front door that evening, Daniel looked up from the table with the calm smile he always wore, the one that never reached his eyes. I thought about what would happen if he saw the paper, if he asked to hold it, to read it, to file it next to the journals and the recordings he was already keeping. My fingers tightened around my bag. I smiled back, but my heart raced so hard it hurt. I wanted to run to hide it somewhere he'd never think to look, but the house already felt like it belonged more to him than to me. Every drawer, every shelf, every lock seemed like it could betray me. That night, I tucked the paper under my pillow instead of the drawer, as if keeping it close could keep it safe. I lay awake listening to Daniel breathe, steady, patient, like a man who knows the numbers will eventually balance. I wondered if he already knew. If he had been waiting for me to slip for the evidence to appear on its own. Maybe he didn't even need to look for it. Maybe he trusted that truth always falls sooner or later. And in the darkness, I pressed my hand against my chest, feeling the thud of my heart against the hidden page, and I swore I could still hear Nina's voice. Keep this somewhere safe. Safe. But what does that mean when your own home isn't safe, when the person beside you is waiting for proof you can't afford to give? The paper was just one page, but it carried the weight of everything. And I knew then that I couldn't let it fall again. The call came on a Thursday evening, a night that should have felt ordinary. My phone lit up on the table beside me, Lydia's name glowing across the screen like a warning flare. For a heartbeat, I considered letting it ring into the void, letting her voice dissolve into voicemail where I could later delete it with a single swipe. My instinct screamed to stay silent, but habit, or maybe a strange loyalty I didn't owe, made me press accept. Emma. She said, her tone sweet enough to lacquer glass sugar poured thick over steel. We're having dinner this Sunday. Just family. You should come. The words flowed too smoothly, practiced and polished like lines she'd rehearsed in front of a mirror. I could hear the false warmth, but underneath it was the sharpness I knew too well, that kind of sweetness that rots before you even taste it. She said it was just dinner. She said it was casual. She said it was necessary. But I knew Lydia. Lydia never invited without motive. Her words were never accidents. They were moves, precise and deliberate, part of a script I hadn't agreed to perform in. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, listening not to what she said, but to the pauses she couldn't control. And then came the lilt. The quiet knife in her tone. It would mean a lot to Mom. Mom. Not my mother, hers. Helen. The matriarch. The keeper of images and illusions. The woman who could polish a family dinner into a portrait of unity, even if the paint cracked the second you looked closely. We'll all be there, Lydia added. It should have sounded inclusive, inviting. Instead, it sounded final. A trap snapping shut. I gave her nothing but a quiet, okay, because anything more would feed her. Anything more would be ammunition. She laughed then softly, the sound of someone winning a game I didn't even want to play. When the call ended, I stayed in the silence, staring at the ceiling, the words circling like birds waiting to descend. Sunday dinner. Just family. No. Not dinner. Not family. A performance disguised as an invitation. It wasn't the first time Lydia had wrapped poison in lace, but something about this one felt different. Heavier, sharper, not about food, not about conversation, not about keeping appearances. This was about me, about dragging me into a room I didn't want to enter, about setting a stage for a play where I was cast as the fool. I thought of the paper still folded beneath my pillow, the medical results I guarded like a fragile secret. I thought of the recorder I had found hidden in my bag, the journal Daniel insisted I fill with symptoms as though my own words weren't enough. Threads of evidence, all of it woven together into a net I hadn't asked to walk into. Sunday wasn't a meal. Sunday was a strategy. When I told Daniel about the invitation, his reaction was perfectly neutral. He nodded, muttered something about family obligations, his tone flat, his face composed. But his eyes betrayed him. They flickered once quick and sharp, not meeting mine. And in that flicker I saw it he already knew. He wanted me there. He needed me there. Which meant whatever was coming wasn't Lydia's game alone. It was bigger, coordinated. And Sunday was where it would surface. The days leading up to it stretched long and thin. At work, my numbers blurred, my columns slipped, my calculations faltered. On the train, my reflection in the window looked unfamiliar, tight, pulled, shadowed. Nina noticed. "Are you okay?" She asked, her voice low, threaded with concern she didn't name. I smiled too quickly, told her it was nothing. Just family. But family was the last word that felt true. Saturday night, I stood in front of my closet like it mattered. I laid out a dress, simple and neutral, something that couldn't be twisted into commentary. But I knew Lydia's gift, turning even silence into guilt, even fabric into weapon. No choice was safe when every detail was evidence for someone else's case. By Sunday morning, my chest felt hollow, as though my body was bracing for impact before the blow landed. The hours moved like rehearsals for a play I hadn't auditioned for, every gesture practiced, every breath mechanical, waiting for the curtain to rise whether I wanted it or not. When I finally stepped outside, the air was unnaturally heavy, thick with that strange stillness that always comes before a storm. The world looked unchanged, trees, swaying cars, passing neighbors, walking dogs, but inside I knew I was walking towards something inevitable. And through it all, Lydia's voice echoed in my ear, sweet and false, just family. But I knew the truth. This wasn't family. This wasn't dinner. This was an ambush wrapped in linen napkins, staged beneath bright chandeliers, polished into respectability. And walking toward it felt like stepping into a room where everyone already knew the ending. Everyone but me. Helen's house glowed like it was built to blind. Every bulb turned up, every chandelier, gleaming white light bouncing off the polished floors until it felt less like a home and more like an interrogation room. The dining table stretched long, too long, draped in linen that smelled faintly of starch and lavender. The silverware was placed with military precision, each knife and fork aligned like soldiers. I stood at the threshold for a moment, blinking against the glare, and when my eyes adjusted, all I saw were faces turned toward me. Not welcoming. Measuring. Each pair of eyes flicking across me as if scanning for weaknesses, as if I were already on trial. Helen rose first, her smile carved carefully onto her face, the kind of smile that doesn't crease the eyes. "Emma," she said, her voice warm in shape but brittle in weight. "You look well." The words should have comforted, but they didn't. They floated in the air like perfumed lies, sweet enough for anyone listening, but sour to the person they were aimed at. Well, I looked well. She said it as though wellness was a costume, as though I'd dressed myself in it for the evening, as though she could decide what it meant. I sat down at the table, my fingers brushing the cool glass of a water goblet, and for a fleeting second I thought maybe I could hold steady. Maybe I could keep the mask in place long enough to get through the meal. But Daniel leaned forward in his chair, his hand casually wrapped around his wine glass. His voice calm, steady, just loud enough for the words to carry. "Careful," he said, his lips twitching in something almost like a smile. "She has a tendency to exaggerate. Sometimes she even pretends." The words hit the table harder than any plate. I felt them settle into the silence, felt every gaze-sharpened slice cut into me. Daniel didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at his mother, at Lydia, at the others, as if offering them the line they'd been waiting to hear. "Pretends." The word clung to me like a shadow, heavy and sticky, making my breath catch. I wanted to speak to correct, to strip the lie clean, but the silence around the table worked faster than my tongue. It grew thick and suffocating until I was the only sound left, the faint scrape of my fork against porcelain, the quick rhythm of my heart hammering in my ears. Lydia smirked into her wine, her satisfaction folded neatly behind the rim of the glass. Helen adjusted her napkin, her eyes never quite meeting mine, her silence louder than agreement. This was their performance. I wasn't guest or family here. I was exhibit. The lights, the table, the symmetry, it was all part of the stage. And Daniel's words were the opening act, the script rehearsed long before I stepped into the glow. I sat perfectly still, but inside every part of me rattled like loose change in a drawer. My hands itched to reach for the paper, still hidden away at home, the results that made my heart stutter. My mind wanted to catalog each detail, the way Daniel's voice didn't crack, the way Helen's smile didn't falter, the way Lydia's laughter rang false. I wanted to file it away like evidence, another receipt in a ledger I was building against them, a record of the night they decided to turn my pain into theater. The food arrived, plates carried in by staff who didn't dare linger, who slid dishes onto the table and vanished into the edges of the bright room. I pushed food around my plate without tasting it, aware of every glance, every whisper of breath. I wasn't hungry. Hunger was for people who belonged. I was too busy swallowing the humiliation Daniel had laid out before me. In that light in that house, I realized something sharper than hunger. I wasn't supposed to defend myself. That was the point. The trap wasn't the dinner itself. It was the silence that followed his words, the way no one corrected him, the way no one asked me to explain. To them, denial was truth enough. Their silence was the verdict. And I knew then that this wasn't the end of it. This was only the beginning, the first cut in a wound they would expect me to carry quietly. But I don't carry things quietly anymore. I keep receipts. And that night, I added Daniel's words to the ledger filed neatly under betrayal witnessed. Have you ever had your pain denied by your own family? Comment 1 if yes, 0 if no. It happened so quickly that for one fractured second, I almost convinced myself it was clumsiness, an accident, nothing more than fabric snagging on a zipper. But the moment I saw the sheet slip free from my bag, fluttering downward in a slow arc, like it had been waiting for its entrance, I knew better. That paper hadn't just fallen, it had revealed itself. One slip, one tug too careless, and the secret I had guarded with my heartbeat was suddenly exposed to the white-lit stage of Helen's dining room. The sound it made when it landed was barely anything at all, just a soft brush of paper against polished wood. But in the silence that room carried, it might as well have been a bomb. Every head turned in unison, eyes sharp, necks snapping toward me like predators catching the scent of blood. My throat closed. My hands froze on the edge of my plate. And then Lydia moved. Her chair scraped deliberately against the floor, the sound jagged, triumphant. Her grin was already there, blooming across her face before she even bent down. She plucked the folded page with fingers that lingered too long, as if savoring the anticipation. "Well, well," she said, voice syrupy with mock surprise. "What's this?" She didn't wait for me to answer. She didn't need to. Let's see, she sang the way children do when they're about to unwrap a gift, her false innocence making my stomach turn. She unfolded the paper slowly, theatrically holding the silence hostage before her eyes darted across the print. She didn't understand the medical terms. She didn't have to. She skimmed until her gaze snagged on the words anyone could use as weapons. Her lips curved sharper, and then she began to read aloud. Abnormal. She dragged the word out until it bent into something grotesque. Elevated levels. Further testing required. Each syllable was stretched, twisted, laced with a rising pitch of mock concern. The first laugh was hers, brittle and piercing like glass under pressure. Daniel's low chuckle joined next a practiced rumble of complicity. Then came the ripple from the others, hesitant at first, uneasy, but loosening once they realized no one was stopping it. Their laughter filled the air, bouncing off the chandelier, swelling against the white walls until it felt as if the house itself was laughing. Helen didn't laugh. Of course she didn't. She pressed her napkin to her lips, her eyes fixed on the page with careful detachment, like she was smoothing a wrinkle from linen. Her silence was worse than laughter. Polished, deliberate, colder than cruelty. I sat frozen fork balanced between my fingers, my chest tight with the effort it took not to break. My throat burned. The tears pressed against me, aching to spill, but I swallowed them hard, forced them down, refused to give Lydia and Daniel the spectacle they wanted. The page was mine. My private proof. Something Nina had once told me to keep safe like it was a lifeline. And here it was stripped of its weight, twisted into comedy. Words that had once terrified me were now nothing but props currency in Lydia's hands, shrinking me smaller, cementing my place at that long table as the evening's entertainment. Daniel leaned back in his chair, glass of wine balanced casually between his fingers. His expression was maddeningly calm, that faint shadow of a smirk always hovering at the edges of his mouth. "Don't take it so seriously," he said lightly as though he were offering kindness. "Emma exaggerates sometimes. You know how she is." His voice was soft, gentle even, but it carried across the table like a verdict. Dismissal dressed up as reason. Certainty disguised as comfort. The laughter swelled again at that. Lydia tilting her head, others nodding faintly, relief in their faces because his words gave them permission to laugh harder. To believe him. To erase me. I gripped the edge of my chair so tightly my knuckles ached, every muscle in me screaming to move, to shout, to snatch the page back and tear it into pieces. But I stayed still. Because if I moved, if I spoke, if I let a single tear escape, I would give them more than they'd already stolen. I forced myself to breathe evenly, to stare at the gleam of the silverware instead of their faces, to hold my silence like armor. Eventually, the laughter waned, tapering into whispers, then into an uneasy quiet that stretched unnaturally long. No one bent down to return the paper. No one even acknowledged it anymore. It lay under Lydia's chair, forgotten, trampled in spirit, even if not in body. But the damage was done. And then came the silence. Heavier than the laughter, more suffocating than the mockery. It pressed against my ribs, filled every space inside me. Not an empty silence, but a full one bloated with judgment. Complicit agreement, words unspoken, but understood by all. The kind of silence that swallows you whole if you let it. I didn't move. I didn't cry. I sat in that merciless light, every eye on me, every breath waiting, knowing that a single sheet of paper had just redrawn my place at that table. Not a guest, not a wife, not even family. A verdict. A sentence written in ink and sealed by silence. And when the weight of that silence finally settled, immovable and final, I knew it wasn't just the end of dinner. It was the end of mercy. In the bathroom, the light was merciless. It poured down in sterile waves, white and sharp, the kind of brightness that belonged in a hospital room, not a family home. There was no forgiveness in it. No warmth. It showed everything, the flushed skin around my eyes, the tremor running through my fingers, the faint trails of salt where tears had dried too quickly. I gripped the edges of the sink as if porcelain could anchor me to the earth. The surface was cold, steady, indifferent, and my palms pressed into it until my bones ached. Slowly, I lifted my eyes to the mirror, bracing myself for what I would see. She was there, me, but diminished smaller. Somehow pulled taut at the edges, as though someone had taken my face and pinched it into a mask. The laughter from the dining room had pressed against my skin, carving dents into it, leaving me hollowed and unfamiliar. And then the words came back looping without mercy. She likes to exaggerate. She pretends. She makes too much of things. Daniel's voice had been calm when he said it. Steady, patient, the voice of reason, the tone anyone else would have believed. But I knew better. Reasonable is worse than rage. Rage at least bares its teeth. Rage declares itself. Reasonable corrodes you, quietly eats through your ribs from the inside out, leaving you smiling as you dissolve. I stared harder at the reflection, waiting for it to shift. Waiting for the woman I used to be to show up, the one who thought family dinners were about gathering, not humiliation. The one who believed silence could sometimes be protection, not complicity. But she didn't come. She was gone. All that looked back was a woman clinging to herself by sheer force of will, her chest rising and falling too quickly, her breath fogging faint patches on the glass. My hands were trembling, but I pressed them harder into the sink, desperate to root myself in something unshakable. My hair was falling loose around my face strands, clinging to my damp cheeks, but I didn't bother to fix them. What was the point of appearances when they had already written the script of who I was supposed to be? Behind me, faint but insistent, the laughter still rang. It seeped under the bathroom door, muffled but merciless. Lydia's brittle delight sharp and triumphant. Daniel's practiced chuckle calculated and rehearsed. And then the silence that followed heavier than all the noise combined. I let it wash over me again, torturing myself with the replay until it wasn't outside anymore. It was inside. Burned into my skull, grafted into my nerves. Helen's careful voice, that too smooth you look well. Daniel's cutting dismissal, she pretends. The scrape of Lydia's chair as she leaned in to read my private results aloud like they were a punchline. Layer upon layer until they weren't their voices anymore, they were mine. My reflection moved its lips silently, whispering those phrases back at me, a cruel chorus, mocking and echoing as if the mirror itself had learned to betray me. I wanted to break it. My hand twitched toward the glass, an instinct begging for release. I wanted to shatter it, to watch it explode into jagged shards, to let the light fracture into 1,000 pieces, too sharp for anyone to ever step across again. But I didn't. My hand wouldn't move. Because breaking the mirror would mean erasing the only witness I had. And I needed the witness. I needed this reflection, however cruel, because it was the only thing that hadn't looked away. It had seen me shaking and hadn't smoothed it over. It had seen me raw, and it didn't deny me. So instead, I leaned closer, forehead almost against the glass breath fogging its surface. My lips parted, and I whispered into the empty air words, meant for no one but me and the mirror. I will keep everything. Every word. Every silence. Every slip of paper. Every smile that cut. Every time they tried to erase me. I will keep it all. My voice cracked thin and brittle, but the promise held. The mirror fogged with each exhale, blurring my face, then clearing again. I pressed my words deeper into the reflection. They won't erase me this time. Not this time. The truth doesn't belong to them anymore. It belongs to me. And I'll hold it until the day it's undeniable. Something steadied in me as I said it. My pulse slowed no longer, frantic, more deliberate. My breath evened out, the trembling in my hands, easing just enough to release the porcelain. The light above me still blazed, but it didn't feel like interrogation anymore. It felt like exposure. It felt like proof. And for the first time that night, I didn't want to hide from it. I wanted it to shine harder, to catch every detail, every flicker, every crack in my armor. Because someday when they tried to twist the story, when they tried to paint me as fragile, hysterical, unstable, I would have this moment, this mirror, this promise. The knowledge that I had seen myself and hadn't looked away. I straightened, slowly smoothing stray strands of hair back from my face. I looked at myself until I almost seemed steady again, until the cracks felt less like wounds and more like maps. They would expect me to come back to the table broken. They would expect me to sit quietly, let their version overwrite mine, let their laughter echo louder than my voice. But I had already decided. My ledger was open. My receipts were waiting. And this time, no one would erase them. Not Helen. Not Lydia. Not Daniel. Not anyone. It was late when I found it, the kind of late where the house itself seemed to hold its breath. The walls wrapped in shadows, the air heavy with stillness. The only sounds were the low, steady hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway, each second echoing louder than it should have, like a reminder that time was moving even when I wished it would stop. Daniel was already asleep. His breathing slow and measured, filling the bedroom with a rhythm, so even it might have been mechanical. Inhale. Exhale. Each one perfectly. Timed, perfectly calm, like a metronome marking out my hesitation. I moved through the dark with the care of someone who had rehearsed it, my body remembering which floorboards betrayed footsteps, which drawers caught if you pulled too quickly, which hinges groaned like they wanted to tell on you. I wasn't searching for anything specific, or maybe I was. Maybe I had been searching for weeks without admitting it. Waiting for the night when curiosity would finally outrun fear, when silence would no longer feel like safety but like complicity. The desk drawer wasn't locked. It never was. Daniel didn't think he needed to lock things around me, as if my silence was insurance, as if my obedience was guarantee enough. I slid it open slowly, letting the thin beam of the hallway light guide me. At first, it was ordinary stacks of envelopes, clipped bills, notes in Daniel's sharp, precise handwriting. Everything orderly. Everything neat. But tucked between them, pressed almost into hiding, was something that didn't belong. A receipt. Crisp folded once, wedged into the corner like it had slipped there by accident, or like it was placed there to wait for me. I unfolded it carefully, my fingers trembling as though paper could cut deeper than knives. My pulse spiked each beat, pushing against my skin. The words glared back at me in plain ink stress test kit. Date. Time. Purchase confirmed. My breath caught hard, snagging in my throat. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't random. This wasn't harmless. This was evidence, another thread in the web Daniel had been weaving around me for months. He wasn't just asking me to write journals, to catalog symptoms, to record myself without knowing. He was collecting, building his own archive. Not a file for us. Not a record for my health, but a ledger against me. The receipt trembled in my hand, the lamp's glow making the ink seem alive, pulsing, daring me to deny what I already knew. I didn't give myself time to think. Thinking would have stopped me. I pulled my phone from my pocket, the screen's glow too bright in the darkness, and snapped a photo. The shutter clicked sharp and violent, slicing through the silence. My whole body froze, my lungs refusing to move. I listened, hard ears straining for the sound of footsteps, for the shift of Daniel waking. Nothing. Just the steady rhythm of his breath down the hall, calm, patient, the kind of calm that made me wonder if he already knew I would find it someday, if he had been waiting for me to be too late. I exhaled slowly, checked the photo twice to make sure it was clear, then folded the receipt with surgical precision, creasing the edges exactly where they had been. I slid it back into the drawer, aligning it perfectly, leaving no trace of my intrusion. My hands still shook, but I forced them steady. Evidence doesn't forgive clumsiness. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out the small USB I had been carrying for weeks. A blank slate, silver and ordinary, waiting for something to justify its existence. It wasn't much, just a tiny stick, but in my hand it felt like armor, like a weapon. I plugged it into my laptop, the port clicking into place with finality, and dragged the photo across. The progress bar filled slowly, deliberate green, inching its way across the screen, while my chest rose and fell with uneven weight. When the file blinked into place, I stared at it far longer than necessary, the glow painting my face in the dark. It wasn't just a picture. It was survival. It was confirmation that I wasn't paranoid, that the accusations Daniel whispered weren't truth, but tactics. This was evidence. And evidence, no matter how small, holds power. I pulled the USB out and held it tightly, its edges cool and sharp against my palm. I thought about where to hide it, someplace ordinary enough to vanish, someplace Daniel would never suspect. I slipped it into a case of old receipts in the back of my closet, the irony so sharp it almost made me laugh. He mocked me for saving receipts, called it obsessive, ridiculous, unnecessary. But this time, the receipts weren't clutter. They were lifelines. Back in bed, I lay stiff beside him, the USB still burning in my mind like a secret heartbeat. He shifted once in his sleep, his arm brushing lightly against mine, and I closed my eyes, forcing my breathing to match his rhythm, forcing stillness into my body even as my blood pounded. He thought I was still inside his ledger, the obedient wife documenting symptoms, the fragile woman too weak to see through him. He was wrong. I had my own ledger now. And piece by piece, I was filling it. Every note, every receipt, every smile, every silence. The archive was mine. And when the time came, it would be undeniable. Have you ever kept receipts to protect yourself? Comment 1 if yes, 0 if no. At work, the walls carried whispers louder than footsteps, and no matter how hard I tried to drown them out with numbers, they seeped in. Rows of figures blinked across my screen, neat columns stacking themselves obediently into order, but my mind refused to hold them. My hands typed, But my head replayed the sound of Nina's voice from that morning, the way she leaned against the edge of my desk, casual in posture but not in tone. She had lowered her voice as if we were conspiring, as if words themselves could be dangerous here. "I thought you should know," she said, her eyes fixed on mine. Her voice wasn't cruel. It wasn't even sharp. But it carried weight. "People are talking. They say you overdo things." That was all. Soft syllables, simple, almost kind. But the weight in them knocked the air from my chest. Overdo things. I knew that phrase. I had heard it too many times already, dressed in different tones, served in different rooms. It was Daniel's favorite dismissal, Lydia's favorite sneer, Helen's favorite excuse. It was the chorus they had been rehearsing around the family table, perfecting it until it sounded inevitable. And now, like water spilled across polished wood, it had leaked outside the house, carried on whispers into the place I still thought I could stand on solid ground. I stared at Nina, the hum of the office vanishing. Phones rang. Keyboards clattered. Someone laughed across the aisle, but it all sounded far away, muffled like I was hearing it through water. My throat tightened as I asked the question I already knew didn't matter. Who said that Nina's gaze didn't shift? She had always been steady, the kind of practical person who could cut through noise without raising her voice. It doesn't matter who, she said gently, her words careful, like she was laying them down for me to walk across. Just be careful. It feels like someone's trying to set you up. The look in her eyes was worse than the words. Not pity exactly, but warning. An acknowledgement that she could see the threads pulling around me even if she wouldn't name them. It twisted in my stomach harder than anything Lydia could have said outright. When she walked away, I stayed perfectly still. My hand froze on the mouse, the cursor blinking against a blank cell on the spreadsheet, keeping time with the pulse in my wrist. I couldn't move. All I could hear was the echo from Sunday's dinner, the laughter brittle and gleeful. Daniel's calm dismissal, she pretends. Lydia's voice dragging my private results into the open like a game. Helen's silence sealing it with polish. It played in my head like a recording I couldn't turn off. And then the rest came back too. The paper falling from my bag, the receipt tucked away in Daniel's drawer. The recorder I had found hidden where it didn't belong. The USB in my closet holding everything I dared to save. Piece by piece, the pattern revealed itself. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't accident. It was construction. A plan. A strategy designed not to destroy me with a single blow, but to chip away at me until no one trusted my voice. She overdoes it. The phrase sank its teeth into me, repeating until it became a trap I couldn't escape. Because once that story takes root, it doesn't matter what you do. Every reaction becomes evidence. Cry and you're dramatic. Stay silent and you're guilty. Defend yourself and you're unstable. There's no right move once the narrative is written, no way to win except to flip the ledger entirely. I leaned back in my chair, staring at my faint reflection in the computer screen. My hands trembled, the kind of tremor I couldn't disguise if someone looked too closely. But beneath it, I felt something harder, something sharper than fear. They wanted to shrink me, to erase the meticulous woman who saved every receipt, every note, every trace of proof. They wanted me rewritten into caricature, fragile enough to break, small enough to dismiss. But I knew better. I knew what they didn't. Truth once kept doesn't vanish. I opened a blank document, the screen glowing white, and typed slowly, deliberately, each keystroke like striking a match. They say I exaggerate. I don't. I record. I remember. I keep what they want to erase. The words steadied me as I wrote them, turned trembling into resolve. Later that night, I saved the file onto the USB, tucking it into the archive I had been building piece by piece, one more receipt in the ledger, only I knew existed. The whispers at work might travel faster than me, might stain me before I had a chance to defend myself. But whispers can only go so far. Evidence lasts. I had patience. I had time. And I had proof. Because now I saw the truth clearly. This wasn't about my health. This wasn't about mistakes. This wasn't about flaws. It was about control. About erasing me and rewriting me into something weak enough to dismiss. and I refused to let them have that ending. Helen's house again, always the same house, the same long table stretching under the glow of lights, too white, too sharp to be called warm. They hummed faintly, those bulbs, a sterile buzz that made the air feel more like an interrogation room than a family dining room. Every dinner here had always felt staged, choreographed, down to the placement of forks and the practiced smiles. But this wasn't dinner. Not tonight. The silverware was gone, the plates absent. In their place sat manila folders, pale and thin, stacked neatly at one end of the table like case files waiting for judgment. At the center of it all, Victor sat stiff-backed posture so exact it looked painful. His hands were folded, his expression unreadable, his suit pressed to perfection. He was family by blood, lawyer by trade, but tonight he was neither fully relative nor fully counsel. He was a witness. Nothing more, nothing less. Daniel's voice cut through first steady calm, the exact cadence he used whenever he wanted his demands to sound like reason. It's just a precaution, he said, sliding one folder across the wood until it came to rest in front of me. The paper inside made the faintest shuffle a whisper of consequence. A psychological evaluation. Standard. Nothing invasive. It's better for everyone if we have it on record. His hand lingered on top of the folder. Fingers relaxed as though he were steadying it or pinning it in place like bait inside a trap. I didn't touch it. Not yet. The words alone were enough to make my stomach knot. Psychological evaluation. I could already hear the echo outside these walls, whispers curling through workplaces, Lydia's coy smile as she told anyone who would listen that I was dramatic. Helen's head tilt and her soft little line, "You look well." This was the end game. Not just rumors. Not just silence. A document. A signature. Something they could brandish as proof that I wasn't to be trusted, that my truth was fiction, and theirs the official record. Victor cleared his throat, the sound dry, careful. "It's voluntary," he said, voice pitched neutral, though his eyes flicked once toward Daniel. Just for a second. A tell. A flicker of unease that betrayed the neutrality he tried to wear. Helen leaned back slowly, posture serene, a portrait of composure. She folded her hands in her lap, but the knuckles were white. Her voice came sugar-sweet. "Emma," she said as though my name were a lullaby. "Sometimes it's easier just to cooperate. It avoids conflict." The pause before that word was calculated. Conflict. What she meant was scandal. What she meant was keep the family clean, keep the narrative polished, sacrifice me if it meant the facade held. Daniel leaned closer, the scent of his cologne sharp, invasive. His gaze stayed steady, patient, rehearsed. "It's nothing," he repeated as salesman, closing his pitch. "Just a paper. You sign it and we move on." His tone carried the casualness of a grocery clerk asking for initials on a receipt, except this receipt was the sharpest blade they'd ever handed me. My fingers hovered near the folder. The edge was cool against my skin, deceptively harmless. I could feel the weight of it without opening it. One signature and every word from my mouth would become suspect. Every protest reduced to symptom, every truth dismissed as paranoia. It wasn't precaution. It was premeditation. I lifted my eyes. Lydia's lips curved in a faint smirk. Eyes alight with the triumph of someone who had already imagined me defeated. Helen's smile held, but her hands betrayed her pressing too tightly together in her lap. Victor sat motionless, a statue bound by neutrality, though the air around him seemed to tense. And Daniel simply waited. Patient, certain. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive, pressing against my chest like a weight. My pulse thundered in my ears. My body screamed at me to run, to push the folder away, to stand. But I didn't move. I thought of the receipts tucked away, the USB hidden in a jewelry box, the stack of evidence that belonged to me alone. They wanted me to fold, to hand them the pen, to let them write my story for me. So I stayed still. I let the silence do the talking. Seconds stretched into something longer, thicker. Daniel's eyes narrowed just slightly, the first crack in his calm veneer. That hairline fracture was enough. I hadn't signed. I wouldn't. If it were you, would you sign just to keep the peace? Comment 1, if yes, 0 if no. The room was already too quiet, that brittle kind of silence that hums like glass just before it breaks. The papers Daniel had slid in front of me still lay untouched, the ink waiting for a signature that would never come. Lydia smirked at one end of the table, Helen wore her practiced calm at the other. Victor sat still in the center like a statue, pretending not to know he was part of the stage. And Daniel leaned back with that faint curve of a smile, the one he used when he thought he'd already won. The weight of it pressed down on me, but so did the weight of everything I had carried: the notebooks, the whispers, the laughter, the paper that fell at dinner, the receipt I copied onto the USB. And in that moment, I decided I wasn't going to sit there and let their silence be louder than my truth. My hand moved slowly, deliberately, to the inside pocket of my bag. I could feel their eyes on me, tracking the movement, suspicion flickering at the edges. My fingers closed around the small recorder, smooth and familiar, the same one Daniel had once hidden in my purse. I placed it on the table. For a second, no one reacted. It was too small, too ordinary. Then I clicked it on and his voice filled the air. "Push her until she falls if you have to." The words spilled out, steady, unmistakable. His voice calm and casual, carrying the same patience he used in every meeting, every dismissal, every explanation. But this time there was no disguise, no careful tone to soften it. Just Daniel's voice, instructing, admitting, exposing. The room cracked open with silence. No one breathed. Lydia's smirk vanished so quickly it was almost violent, her lips parting, but no sound coming. Helen's composure faltered, her eyes flicking toward her son, and then away, as if even looking too long at him might stain her. Victor shifted for the first time, the mask of neutrality, trembling, his jaw tightening like he was swallowing words he wasn't allowed to speak. And Daniel didn't move. His smile vanished, yes, but he sat there rigid, his knuckles white where they pressed into the arms of his chair. His eyes found mine, and for the first time in years, there was no calm calculation in them. Just the briefest flicker of something, raw fear, maybe, or rage, or both. I let the recorder play the words, echoing again louder in the silence. "Push her until she falls if you have to." Proof. Evidence. His own voice, the one thing they couldn't twist, couldn't dismiss as exaggeration. My heart thundered in my chest, my palms damp against the table, but I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. The chandelier above us buzzed faintly, its crystals trembling as though even the house knew the weight of what had just been dropped into the center of that polished table. I felt every second stretch, every breath or lack of breath settle heavy. This was what I had promised myself in the bathroom mirror, what I had sworn to keep everything, to hold every truth they tried to erase. And now here it was, undeniable, playing out in his own voice while their silence betrayed them more than words ever could. No one reached for the paper anymore. No one asked me to sign. The folder lay forgotten, eclipsed by the tiny device glowing red between us. It was small, but it carried more weight than any of them could bear. I looked at them one by one, their faces caught in that unbearable pause. Lydia, wide-eyed, finally stripped of her weaponized smile. Helen, her lips pressed into a thin line, the image she worked so hard to polish slipping through her fingers. Victor staring at the recorder like it was evidence in a trial he hadn't agreed to preside over. And Daniel, rigid, exposed, undone. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The silence was louder than anything I could have said. And in that silence, I realized something that made my chest steady. They had wanted me small, dismissed, erased. But truth doesn't erase. Truth echoes. And now it echoed in every corner of that house, in every stunned expression, in every breath they didn't dare take. The recorder clicked off. Still, no one moved. The silence stretched heavy and infinite, the kind of silence that changes everything it touches. No one breathed. The recorder's click still hung in the air, that faint mechanical sound swallowed by silence, so thick it seemed to press against the walls. Daniel's voice had already done its work. "Push her until she falls if you have to." A sentence that refused to dissolve, replaying in every corner of Helen's immaculate dining room like a bell that could not be unrung. But what I remember most wasn't Daniel's voice, or even the look that passed across Helen's face when she realized her son's calm veneer had cracked wide open. What I remember was Lydia. She sat 3 seats down, a glass of wine still in her hand, the stem glinting under the chandelier. And right as the words filled the room, his words undeniable, her lips curled. Just slightly. A half smile, the kind that doesn't bear teeth but carries more weight than laughter ever could. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't horror. It was satisfaction, quiet and razor-sharp, blooming at the exact moment her brother's betrayal became undeniable. I watched her carefully memorizing the angle, the way her eyes flickered sideways toward Helen as if to confirm the power shift she had always been waiting for. Lydia had spent years cutting at me with whispers and smirks, planting doubts like seeds in every conversation. But this was different. This was triumph disguised as composure, the expression of someone who had always believed I was fragile and had just been handed proof on a silver platter. Not proof of my weakness, but proof of Daniel's cruelty, and by extension, proof that she could finally stand taller in the ruins. The others didn't notice. Or maybe they pretended not to. Victor's eyes stayed fixed on the recorder, his silence stretched so tight it might have snapped if anyone spoke. Helen pressed her lips together, her napkin still in her lap. Her face the portrait of a woman who wished evidence could simply evaporate into air. Daniel stared at me, stone still, his eyes flat and furious. But I didn't look away. Because all I could see was Lydia's mouth, that curl, that trace of victory bleeding through. It was subtle, fleeting. If you blinked, you'd miss it. But I didn't blink. I never blink when truth shows its face. And in that moment, I realized the cruelty of family isn't always the hand that pushes you. It's the smile that follows the witness who savors the fall. The sibling who doesn't catch you. Because catching you would mean losing the spectacle. I thought back to the dinners, the whispers at work, the laughter when my test results hit the floor. I thought of Nina's warning of the USB hidden deep in my closet, of my own reflection in the mirror when I promised myself to keep everything. And now here it was, the most dangerous receipt of all. Not a paper, not a file, not even Daniel's voice. A smile. One that told me everything about how deep the betrayal ran, one that exposed what no test or document ever could, that this wasn't about one man's cruelty. It was about a family's choice. Lydia lifted her glass slowly, her half-smile fading into something neutral, almost bored, as if she hadn't just revealed herself. She sipped the wine, the liquid catching the light, and set the glass back down with precision. The smile was gone. But I had already seen it. I had captured it in my memory with the same sharpness as any photograph, and I knew no silence, no denial, no polished story could erase it. The room stayed frozen. No one dared move. The recorder sat quiet now, the light blinking faintly, evidence compact enough to fit in a pocket, yet heavy enough to shift the balance of everything that came next. I could feel the weight of their stares, but I didn't lower my eyes. Not to Daniel. Not to Helen. Not to Victor. I kept them on Lydia, replaying that small, treacherous smile over and over until it seared itself into me. Because in families like this, betrayal isn't always loud. It's subtle, sharp, a shadow across a mouth at the exact moment truth slips free. It's the smile of someone who wants you broken, not because they pushed you, but because they were waiting for the chance to watch. And when people ask me later how I knew, how I kept track, how I built the case that would one day free me, I won't talk about the papers or the receipts or the USB. I'll talk about that night, that table, that silence. And I'll tell them about the curve of Lydia's lips, the exact angle of it, the proof of her delight when Daniel's voice condemned itself. That smile was the cleanest evidence of all. That's the evidence I will never forget. I met Clara in a corner cafe downtown, the kind of place where the clatter of cups and the hiss of the espresso machine wrapped everything in a blanket of noise that felt safer than silence. She was late as always, moving with that calm stride of a woman who never lets urgency show on her face. Clara Wu had been my friend once, before she became my lawyer, before I had anything worth lawyering over. But tonight, I slid a folder across the table like it carried my pulse inside it. Papers, photographs, the USB. Every receipt I had gathered, every shred of proof I had been hoarding like a woman building an ark before the flood. Her hands were steady as she flipped through her eyes, sharp and unflinching the way they always were when words like liability or evidence took the air out of the room. She didn't look at me right away. She looked at the papers, at the photos of the receipt for the stress test kit, at the transcripts I had typed out from Daniel's recorder, at the notes I'd scrawled in the margins with shaking hands. She clicked the USB into her laptop, scrolled through the files, listened to the recording until Daniel's voice filled even this safe little cafe. Push her until she falls if you have to. The barista behind us frothed milk steam curling in the air, but Clara didn't blink. Finally, she shut the laptop, folded her hands, and met my eyes. Im lang ja het han. She said softly her Vietnamese, threading through the English before she repeated it in the language of law, sharp and clear. Silence has expired. It's time to let the documents speak. The words cracked something open inside me. For months, silence had been my shield and my prison. I had kept quiet at the dinner table while Lydia read my medical results like comedy. I had kept quiet in Helen's house when Daniel slid papers across the table demanding my signature on evaluations meant to erase me. I had swallowed my voice in bathrooms and trains whispered only to mirrors and shadows. Silence had been survival. But Clara was right. Silence had also been consent. Silence had let them build their narrative brick by brick while mine stayed locked in my chest. I wrapped my hands around the coffee cup in front of me, though it had gone cold. If I speak, I said, my voice barely steady, they'll come after me harder. They'll say I'm unstable. They'll say this is just another exaggeration. Clara leaned forward, her eyes steady, her voice low but firm. Emma, they're already saying it. That's the strategy. You keeping quiet doesn't stop them, it feeds them. The only thing that changes the story is evidence. And you have it. She tapped the folder between us, each touch like the tick of a gavel. You've been documenting for months. Every receipt, every slip, every word. This is no longer just memory. This is proof. And proof speaks in ways even the most practiced silence can't erase. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to breathe in the certainty she carried like armor. But fear is sticky. It clings. I saw Helen's polished smile, Lydia's half smirk, Daniel's steady calm. I saw the way Victor had looked at me, torn but silent neutrality, his only refuge. Families like theirs and like mine now don't crumble easily. They tighten their grip, choke you with silence, and tell the world you brought it on yourself. Clara's voice softened, but her words cut sharper than ever. You've done the hardest part. You kept everything. Now let me systematize it. Let me turn your survival into a case. I swallowed hard, my eyes stinging not from weakness, but from the sheer release of finally hearing someone say what I'd been carrying all along, that I wasn't crazy. That silence wasn't strength anymore, it was surrender. And I was done surrendering. The cafe bustled around us, cups clinking, doors opening, the city moving on with its life. But at our little table, time shifted. My folder lay between us like a living thing, every page a witness, every file a voice. Clara rested her hand on it, steady, protective. They want to control the story, she said. We'll show them the ledger. We'll show them the truth. I nodded slowly at first, then with the certainty of someone who has nothing left to lose but silence. Because silence had been the currency of their power. And I was bankrupting it tonight. Do you believe silence is golden, or do you believe only truth can save you? Comment 1 for silence, 0 for truth. The night I returned to Helen's house, the table was set as if nothing had happened. The same white light blazed from the chandelier, the same polished wood stretched out like a stage. But this wasn't dinner, not this time. The silverware was gone. No flowers, no wine, no script of polite laughter. Just the long table chairs filled with faces that had already decided who I was. Helen sat at her usual place posture, regal hands folded as though this were simply another family gathering. Lydia leaned back, smirk tugging at the corner of her lips, the same expression that had haunted me since the night she read my test results aloud. Daniel sat beside her, calm as always, the mask of reason plastered across his face. Victor was there too. The lawyer cousin, his expression taut. His silence, the only way he knew how to survive rooms like this. I walked in carrying nothing visible but my bag My shoes clicked against the tile, steady, deliberate. They watched me the way predators watch prey, waiting for the stumble, the weakness, the chance to confirm the story they had already rehearsed. But I didn't stumble. I didn't shake. I pulled out the small silver USB and placed it at the center of the table like it was the crown jewel they had been trying to bury. "This," I said, my voice level steady enough that it startled even me as proof. I didn't raise it higher. Didn't slam it down, didn't need to. The word carried its own weight. Proof. It hung in the air heavier than accusations, heavier than excuses. I looked at each of them in turn. I don't need to cry. I don't need to scream. I don't need to beg you to believe me. This speaks on its own. Daniel shifted, his jaw tightening, but he stayed silent. Lydia's smirk faltered, flickering into something sharper, narrower. Helen didn't move at all. She was stone. Her face carved in marble, pretending not to see the tiny device glowing red like an ember on the polished surface. I slid the recorder beside it, the same one Daniel had once hidden in my purse, the same one that had captured his voice without him realizing the ledger was no longer his to keep. I pressed play. His words filled the room. "Push her until she falls if you have to." Calm, deliberate, unmistakable. The air shifted, every molecule pulled taut. My pulse thundered in my ears, but I didn't flinch. I stood still, watching their faces as the sentence replayed my silence, louder than any argument I could have made. For a moment, there was nothing. No clinking glasses, no awkward coughs, no shifting chairs. Just the sound of Daniel's own voice, condemning him, bouncing off the walls that had so often echoed with staged laughter. Then I stopped it. My finger pressed the button and the sound cut off. Not with a dramatic flourish, but with a half-beat of silence. That silence was mine. I wanted it. I let it sit thick and unbearable, pressing against them the way their silences had pressed against me. No one rushed to fill it. No one dared. I looked at them again, my voice lower now but sharper than ever. You wanted to erase me, to turn me into the fragile one, the exaggerator, the unstable wife. But truth doesn't erase. It records. And now it's recorded. I tapped the USB lightly once, like a gavel hitting wood. This is what you can't silence. Not anymore. Helen's lips parted, but no words came. Lydia's eyes darted toward her mother, then back at me, her smirk gone, replaced by something tighter, meaner. Daniel's face flushed, the calm finally cracking, but he didn't speak. He knew better than to argue with his own voice. Victor looked at me just for a second, and though he didn't nod, I saw the shift, the recognition that something irreversible had just been placed on the record. I didn't sit down. I didn't offer them comfort. I let the silence expand, let it suffocate the lies they had built. Every second of it was a reversal, a ledger balancing in real time. And when I finally turned and walked out of that house, leaving the USB still glowing red on the table, I knew I didn't need their acknowledgement. I didn't need their apologies or their denials. I had something stronger. I had proof. And proof, unlike family silence, does not die. They wanted me to prove pain the way you prove a bill. To them, suffering was not real unless it could be itemized, unless it came with documentation, unless I could present it the way an accountant presents a balance sheet. Neat rows, clear columns, totals that could be verified. They wanted bruises to be invoices, silence to be receipts, betrayal to be a transaction that had to be justified before it could be believed. And for months I let them push me into that role. I became the archivist of my own pain. I wrote, I saved, I copied, I hid. Not because I wanted to live like that, but because deep down I knew someday they would demand proof, and I would need to have it ready. And I did. I kept everything. Every slip of paper that wasn't meant for me. Every recording they thought would catch me, but instead caught them. Every whispered insult folded into polite conversation. Every cruel smile sharpened at my expense. I saved it all because when you live in a family that refuses to believe you, silence alone is never enough. Silence becomes ammunition for them, but evidence becomes survival. When I placed the USB on the table, when I pressed play, when Daniel's own voice filled the room, push her until she falls if you have to, I thought I would feel victorious. And in a way, I did. Watching their faces pale, watching Helen's composure crack, watching Lydia's smirk vanish like smoke, it was proof that truth had finally broken through. For once, it wasn't my word against theirs. For once, silence didn't win. The evidence did. But here's what no one tells you. Evidence doesn't heal. Proof doesn't make you whole. It doesn't rebuild the trust. It doesn't stitch the family back together. It doesn't undo the nights you cried alone, whispering into mirrors just to hear your own voice say you weren't crazy. Proof simply confirms what you already knew. That they were willing to erase you. That they were willing to let you fall, and worse, that some of them smiled when it happened. I think about that often. The ledger of betrayal is not just Daniel's voice. It's Lydia's half-smile blooming at the exact moment she should have been horrified. It's Helen's polished denial, her insistence on smoothing napkins instead of facing truth. It's Victor's neutrality, his refusal to act until the paperwork forced his hand. And Daniel, with his calm tone, his accountant's patience, the man who turned marriage into an audit and expected me to fail. Each of them tried to turn me into a number, an entry that could be crossed out, a column that could be erased without throwing off the totals. But I wasn't erased. I'm still here. And I am the one keeping the books now. Every page they tried to rip from me, I kept. Every silence they wrapped around my pain, I recorded. Every attempt to bury me only gave me more proof to rise with. They thought evidence would trap me, but evidence freed me. So I end it like this. They wanted me to prove my pain as if it were an expense, a bill they could question, a cost I had to justify to people who caused it in the first place. And I did. I built the ledger. I balanced the books. I placed it in front of them so they could see the truth they had tried to deny. And now that evidence stands taller than their silence ever could. But this story isn't just mine. It never is. Because I know you felt it too in your own ways. Maybe not at a long, polished table under a blinding chandelier. Maybe not with receipts and recorders, but in the quiet moments where someone you loved asked you to prove the very thing they should have believed. Maybe they told you you were exaggerating. Maybe they laughed. Maybe they folded your truth into a joke and waited for you to swallow it. And maybe you did because silence seemed safer than the fight. But silence doesn't save you. It preserves their version of the story. And I promise you this, once you hold proof in your hands, whatever your proof looks like, silence becomes impossible. Proof echoes. Proof speaks. Proof refuses to die. So now I turn it back to you because my ledger is open and I'm done keeping it alone. Have you ever been forced to hand over an emotional invoice just to be believed? Have you ever had to prove your pain as if it were a transaction instead of a truth? Comment 1 if yes, 0 if no. And tell me, where are you listening from? Because truth doesn't belong to me alone. Truth spreads when we share it, when we refuse to let silence write the ending. Tonight, I've given you mine. And I want to hear yours. Because they wanted me erased. They wanted me silent. But here I am, louder than ever, ledger balanced, receipts intact. And here you are listening. That's how truth survives.